And a few more members of the commission will be joining us shortly, but we're going to go ahead and get started. I think as everyone knows, this is the final meeting of the work group to make its recommendations to the full commission. And we have, of course, a full agenda for today's session and in preparation of taking our final vote later in the day. So to get us to that point, let me turn to Rachel to start us through the material.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's like we're in school, right? Okay. Okay. So in your folders are various materials that I'm going to walk through with the help of Scott Gates and Justin Silverstein and others. And I think, generally speaking, I would say if you have a question, go ahead and ask it as we go along, as opposed to holding them. But I will say, for starters, that what you do have in front of you is the proposed 10-year phase-in of the recommendations of the commission on a more even, proportionate slide. And for fiscal 21, 22, and 23, we have the county by county distributions through the state aid formulas and what the local share of the formulas would be, as well as some comparisons to local appropriations and MOE. And then, of course, we have updated the fiscal 30 numbers at full implementation by county, state, and local. So that's what we've been able to pull together for you for today. Overall, every school system will receive, of course, a significant increase under the blueprint work group's proposal that is before you than under current law. Current law is growing at about 2% a year, give or take, and under the commission's, or under the blueprint proposal that is before you, the average growth over the from fiscal 20 to 30 is 5.6% a year. So that is the proportionate increase of 5.6% a year over the 10-year period. That includes both what would have been provided under current law and the additional dollars being provided through the work group's proposal. And that is where this doubling, more than doubling of current law growth comes in, because current law is roughly 2%, a little more than 2%. We're talking about 5.6%. So that's the more than double. And the first...
The addition is 3%.
Just on percentages? Yes. There's a long sheet that you have in your folder with the yellow on the top. That is the 10-year phase-in, and it shows you where that 5.6% comes in. Whereas the original commission phase-in proposal, it was very front-loaded, and it also had it was very front-loaded, and then it sort of moderated, and then it grew at the end, whereas this is a more steady growth. Over the first 3 years, so fiscal 21, 22, and 23, it averages at about 5.5%. It's a little more in some years, a little less than others, which takes into account, essentially, to some degree, the dollars that have already been set aside by the legislature to fund the blueprint during fiscal 20 through 22. And just to remind you, the numbers on this sheet are only state funding, so this does not reflect the local side of the equation yet. In total, by fiscal 2030, state education aid will exceed about $10.2 billion, so it's a $2.8 billion increase in state aid over what would have been provided in current law. And the local governments will be expected to fund the local share of both the existing formulas and the new formulas, nearly all of them, beginning in fiscal 22 under this proposal. And that will total about $8.9 billion in fiscal 2030.
Yes. Yeah, please.
And of the 2.8 increase, the local share of that would be the total.
Of the $2.8 billion increase, I'm sorry, what was the question? The 2.8 billion is state aid.
State.
The 2.8 billion is state aid. So maybe let's go to, you have long sheets in your packets that have a staple. And it says fiscal 2030 model direct state aid.
Right.
Okay. So, and thank you. It's on the screen there. So what this is showing, state aid under the model fully implemented in fiscal 2030, and we've showed you this before. These numbers are just updated to reflect all the decisions that you've made. And you can see in the second to last column, dollar difference versus fiscal 2030 current. That is where the $2.8 billion increase is over current law in fiscal 2030. And you can see the amount increases in state aid and the percentage increases over fiscal 2030 current law. And in the total direct column, you can see the 10.25 billion. So that's the in excess of 10.2 billion. So this is fiscal 30 fully implemented in fiscal $30. The next sheet shows that same information in fiscal $20. So it's in fiscal $20, it's an $8.3 billion total with a $2.2 billion increase over current law. And then the next page is the local share in fiscal 30. And on this page, what it shows is the local share of all of these formulas in fiscal 30. And it totals the $8.9 billion in fiscal 30. That is different from, that is not the increase in local funding that will be necessary. This is just the local share of all of those formulas. We have another page that provides a little more information on local share. I was going to get to that in a little while, but okay. So, since we're in fiscal 30, so one thing that is shown on the local share page is in the concentration of poverty column, there is $52.7 million. That reflects only requiring counties that are benefiting from the floor, the 40% floor in the commensurate education formula, only requiring those counties to pay the local share of concentration of poverty. For all the other counties, the state is picking up that piece of the cost, which is part of the reason that the fiscal 30 state aid amount is larger than it was last week. So sort of working our way down the overview bullets, still on the first page.
Yes, Secretary Brinkley.
Which would show, I guess, where they are or what the delta would be. Because I didn't see that summarized in there, but you're getting to that later. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to confirm it. I didn't want to belabor it.
Okay. So then there's another sheet in your packet. It should be the next one from behind the agenda that says proposed phase-in of state funding. It's from fiscal 20 to 24.
Yes, it says proposed phase-in of state funding fiscal 20 to 24. And it's on the screen now.
And so part of what the staff was tasked with doing for this meeting was coming up with a proposal for you to consider that would provide that more even distribution increase in state funding and local funding, but in phasing in the total cost of the commission's proposals over the first few years of the phase-in. So as I said before, we do have county by county numbers for some of the years, but before we get to that, wanted to talk about this at sort of a higher level. And what this is showing in fiscal 20, this is the blueprint funding that was enacted by the legislature during this past session. And so you can see it totals $251.8 million in state aid, new money that was provided toward the implementing the commission's recommendations in fiscal 20. There's a little more money, about $4 million for some other state categorical programs that is not reflected here because this is only state aid going to the school systems. So you can see how that's been distributed in fiscal 20. And so what we did is we kind of built off of that for fiscal 21 through 24 in terms of what the priorities were that had been funded and other priorities. And for fiscal 21, we are thinking about that as a transition year. So there would be additional funding provided for a couple of programs that I'll talk about in a minute, but the formulas would remain as they are in current law. Beginning in fiscal 22 is when new formulas for the foundation, the targeted programs, the new concentration of poverty, per pupil funding, and other categorical streams of funding, those would all start in fiscal 22 and phase up to fiscal 30. So, for example, you can see in fiscal 21, there are dollars for college and career readiness, about $32 million. This reflects the funding for the dollars that we had talked about going into the base for every student to get to college and career readiness. And that is the state share of that funding. There's also about $5.2 million in fiscal 21 for teacher supplies and technology. This is also something that we talked about that would go into the per pupil foundation amount. And this provides about $83 per teacher for supplies and technology in fiscal 21. The next line is the continuation of the 3% salary increase funding that was provided in fiscal 20. The line after that, post college and career readiness and CTE pathways. This provides dollars for, this is the $500 for each 11th and 12th grader who is college and career ready to pursue the CTE pathways and also early college pathways, essentially. Below that, there's $58.7 million for concentration of poverty. This is a continuation of the funding that was provided in fiscal 20 under the blueprint. And the growth reflects additional schools coming into the program at the 80% concentration of poverty level. Those schools are receiving the funding for those two positions, the community schools coordinator and the healthcare practitioner. Special education, the funding, the increase that was provided in fiscal 20, $65.5 million, is continued in fiscal 21, as is the transitional supplemental instruction, aka tutoring funds that were provided under the blueprint. And then pre-K, full day pre-K is $52.9 million in fiscal 21. This provides funding for every 4-year-old who is enrolled in public pre-K full day. And so that reflects that increase based on the number of 4-year-olds who are going to be enrolled in fiscal 21. And then in addition, there's the $2 million that was provided so that there was a mental health coordinator in every school system. And so that totals here on this page, it totals about $334 million. In total, it is about $345 million or $355 million. But $345 million, which also reflects a little bit of inflation costs, sort of the normal inflation that in those programs growing.
So, Rachel, you mentioned that we were thinking of 2021 as a transition year, and we would still be using the old formula.
Exactly.
Okay. My question is that because, is that a mechanical issue? That is, the transition to the new formulas will just take that amount of time, or is that tied to the phasing?
It's mostly a technical issue, but it's both. It's really both, okay. In the sense that the way the formulas work and the way the law works, anything that is required that passes in law this coming session would not actually be mandated funding until fiscal 2022.
I got you.
And so the governor and whatever funds are put into the budget will be put into the budget based on the existing formulas. And so it's easier really to add additional dollars without going in and changing the formulas for the year that the budget is being considered.
But the blueprint recommendations would be off and running in 2021, even though we were still using the old.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in fact, there already are in
Right.
fiscal 2020.
Exactly.
Under the blueprint.
So
Exactly.
the other question I had was in the bill, the blueprint bill, money was identified. I don't know what the term of art is in 2021. And is that 334 consistent with that amount of money?
It is.
Okay.
The funding was identified to cover about $355 million of costs. What is not shown on this page in fiscal 21, because we didn't want to confuse everyone, although I think there's a risk either way, is there in fiscal 21, their declining enrollment grants are still being funded. So we know that starting in fiscal 22, we're going to start funding through the foundation program, the greater of the September 30 enrollment or the rolling 3-year average. Mm-hmm. You all decided that. So that cost is included in this proposal starting in fiscal 22. In fiscal 21, we're still in the world where we're providing this additional add-on declining enrollment grant for the counties that have a higher enrollment using the 3-year average.
Right.
And that was originally estimated to be a cost of $16.7 million in fiscal 2021. We will not know until we get the September 30 enrollment counts from this fall what the full cost of those grants is going to be for fiscal 2021. But that is funded in fiscal 21, but it is not shown on this page because it's sort of a one-time grant under the blueprint. Moving in.
Yes.
You sure? Okay. So then beginning in fiscal 22, as I said, the proposal is to begin phasing in the new formulas and changes to the formulas. So, for example, the college and career readiness funds continue on, and they will be rolled into the foundation program, as we showed you in the per pupil foundation amounts. This is the state share. That is the state share of those dollars. The teacher supplies and technology, the state share of those dollars will be rolled into the foundation amount. You can see it's half of the amount provided in 21. In fiscal 21, essentially, the proposal is that the dollars, that the state would be providing additional dollars. There would be no required additional local contribution in fiscal 21 for these funds, other than the current maintenance of effort requirement. So there would be no change to local contributions for fiscal 2021 beyond what would already be required in current law. Starting in fiscal 22, under the proposal, the counties would be putting in the local share of all of the formulas, or MOE, whichever is the higher amount. In 22, then, you can see the next line down, teacher salary increase. This would provide in 22, the increase reflects the next 3%. The commission had recommended a total of a 10% teacher salary increase to bring salaries up to comparable to other professionals and also Massachusetts and New Jersey. And so the fiscal 22 amount would allow for a 3% salary increase beginning in January of 2022. And then in fiscal 23, it would provide for so the commission's proposal was 3%, 3%, 4%. The last 4% is spread out between 23 and 24, so it would be 2% in January of 2023, and then another 2% in January of 2024.
Is that an example of
Smoothing?
Smoothing?
Okay. Yes, exactly. The next line down, the post-college and career ready and CTE pathways, you can see in fiscal 22, the amount is a little more than half. This reflects only the state share being paid through the formula. This would be for college and career readiness and CTE pathways. This would be a new formula, a separate formula that would be funded based on the number of 10th graders or 11th grade, the number of 10th graders who are college and career ready at the end of 10th grade. The concentration of poverty is the next line, and I'm actually going to ask Justin to talk through this one, please.
So in 2022, what we've done is in 2020 and 2021, we are funding those schools who have at least 80% of their students in poverty or above with the 2 positions. What we are beginning to add in 22 is some of the per pupil funding. And so there's an additional $31 million. The way that we've looked at this is for every district, we've looked at the proportional share of that funding that would go to schools above 80% and distributed that $31 million equally. And so if you have any schools who are above 80%, which is a flat per pupil amount, per reduced price lunch amount, you receive some of the funding. And so we're starting to just implement that per pupil funding in just an equitable basis across all the schools.
That was in fiscal,
That's in fiscal 22. Do you want me to walk through 23 and 24?
yes, please.
Okay. Then in 23, we are beginning to add additional pot of money. We're increasing the pot of money for per pupil for those above schools above 80%, and we're also bringing in the 2 positions for schools that are above 70%, along with some funding. So that's in that year. And then in 2024, we are continuing the positions for all the schools above 70%, increasing the pot again for those schools above 80%, and starting to bring in some per pupil funding for schools that are above the 75%. So we're trying to figure out how we can start to bring in more and more of the schools, both on the positions and the per pupil funding over time as we move towards FY30.
So Justin, is this another example of the smoothing?
Yes.
Okay, so more of these funds were packed in the earlier years, and you've spread them out over 3 years, basically.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think, as Rachel's mentioned a couple times, it's important to remember on the positions, that is for everybody state funding. For the per pupil amount, it is state funding except for districts who receive the floor, then they will have a local match.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Justin, you covered that we would reach the 70% threshold in FY23. Do we not reach the 55% envisioned in the recommendations until FY30, or does it happen sooner than that, but just later than FY24?
It is, the 55% will be in the out years, but it will happen before FY30, though, again, it's the full funding piece will happen in FY30. What we're trying to do is model out basically bringing in another tier of schools basically each year as we go forward. There's just a balance between what can you put in the per pupil funding and what and when you do the full positions, because the full positions we are not taking a percentage of it. It's on or off, so they tend to cost a little bit more when you bring in another set of schools.
And is it envisioned that we go from 80 to 70 to 65 to 60 to 55, or what's that slope look like in terms of bringing in the positions? I understand the per pupil funding piece.
Jump in here and help Justin out. We have our little schedule here. So they're 5%, so it would go down in 5% bands. So the 75 to 80, then 70 to 75. In fiscal 24, we get the positions, and then the next year they would begin to get per pupil funding. So in fiscal 27, the schools between 55 and 60 would get the positions, and in fiscal 28, starting in fiscal 28, they would get some per pupil funding under what we're proposing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So to a degree, what's happening with the concentration in poverty grant is similar to the implementation of pre-K in that it's a gradual phase-in.
Essentially, what we've tried to do in a somewhat targeted way is gradually phase in elements of all the different policy areas. So that, because we know that what the Commission's proposal is a systemic set of recommendations, and achieving the results is dependent on all of those pieces moving forward. And so exactly, we tried to sort of incrementally move everything along within this new phase-in proposal, which has the growth more proportionate.
Can you speak to the plan around, I mean, this is where sort of policy and money gets interwoven, in that in the recommendation from the Kirwan report includes a governance body or some oversight entity around accountability. As the phase-in happens, I would imagine that the governing board is looking at the actual implementation. So not sort of a, how did we do in 10 years, but on a quarterly or, half-year basis, checking in to say, if you have a lot of funds come in to employ community school coordinators, are those coordinators actually hired? Or was there a supply? Or the health practitioners, which is, I know, been an issue, just sort of the supply of healthcare professionals, that would be happening through the phase-in as part of this, which would be very different from the Thornton formula that was just sort of a formula basis at the end. This would be much more accountable, targeted, purposeful funding for outcomes.
So I think I'm glad you asked that question. I think one of the benefits of a more slow phase-in is it allows the school systems to have time to plan, develop their implementation plan. So what the Commission's recommendations called for is that every LE will develop every school system will develop an implementation plan, and that would show how they plan to implement the recommendations within each of the policy areas over the whole 10-year period. And that would then be reviewed and approved by the new governing board, the oversight board in the Commission's terminology. And then each year, that board would be looking at the progress that each LEA was making against their approved plan and how the dollars were being spent. And at the same time, and I should also mention, some of the funding, while we're still accounting for the spending, the dollars that relate to funding the oversight board, some of the infrastructure and capacity that we know we need to build out, are not reflected in these numbers because these only reflect the dollars that are going to the school systems, right? Mm-hmm. So it doesn't reflect other state spending that will be happening under the Commission's recommendations. So one thing the Commission recommended was starting to build out what they called expert review teams. These are teams of professionals and in some cases within the state, existing professionals in school systems who would be visiting schools around the state and observing what was going on in those schools, how the dollars were being spent, what the outcomes were, and essentially reporting back on at the school level on the degree to which a school was implementing recommendations and making progress. And if that wasn't happening, there's sort of a series of steps that would occur under the Commission's recommendations.
Thank you.
Yes, Secretary Foster.
So, Rachel, could you just expand on that and tell us essentially what would happen if there's non-compliance and what those steps are that would have to be complied with?
So what the Commission envisioned is that the review teams would make recommendations to the school system, other stakeholders in the community and the state. And the school's leadership would have the opportunity to review those recommendations and determine what pieces of it they wanted to implement or if they had other ideas for different things to do to improve their outcomes. And then if the review team still did not feel that the progress was being made sufficient and that the dollars were not being spent perhaps the way they could be better spent, then it's sort of a scaling up of, first they're kind of recommendations, then they become a little stronger in terms of, we want to see you doing this. And if the school is either not doing that, then it becomes a potential of the withholding of dollars to that school until the dollars are spent on the best practices and the things that the commission is recommending, evidence-based research that is working in other schools and systems around the country and the world. So it's sort of an escalating series of recommendations that become requirements and dollars that have to follow those requirements or recommendations.
Opportunity for correction.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
I think we can move on.
Okay. As we know, the commission also recommended additional dollars for English learners, for special education, and so the next two lines on the sheet that we've been walking through started in fiscal 22 starts to provide additional dollars for English learners, which grows to $60 million in addition to current law by fiscal 24. And again, with special education, it would provide 106.5 million more by fiscal 24 than current law. The transitional supplemental instruction, the commission's recommendation was to phase up to full implementation, which is the roughly 93 million total cost, half of it, 46 million state cost. In the commission's recommendations, the phase up is a little faster than what we're proposing, and then it phases down because it is transitional in the sense that it's intended to sort of provide this additional assistance for students who are not on grade level by grade 3 in reading and in math, and with reading being the priority. And so the idea is that as the whole system is being implemented, the need for those transitional dollars goes away. We have, because the phase up is going to be slower under this proposal, we're also going to slow down the phase out in the intervening years before fiscal 30. Pre-kindergarten is growing to about $96 million by fiscal 24. This does not reflect the additional $26.6 million that the state is currently fully funding now, or previously federal funds were covering a portion of it, for pre-K expansion grants. Ultimately, those expansion grants would get rolled into the new full-day pre-K formula, but during this phase-in period, the pre-K expansion grants will continue on they're funded right now at $26.6 million a year, and those dollars will be targeted to converting half-day slots to full-day slots for 4-year-olds and creating or funding new slots both in the public schools and with the community providers.
Yeah. Senator Ferguson.
And what happens with childcare subsidy?
Child care subsidy is in, so there are no increased dollars going to child care subsidy under this proposal. The legislature has passed legislation that increased the subsidy for the market rate and also opened up additional, some of the tiers that were frozen. And MSD through regulations has done more of that. So under what I would call current law now, child care subsidy is growing substantially, dollars available for child care subsidy. Ultimately, this will free up some of those additional child care subsidy dollars, because dollars that today might go for a 4-year-old for who is not in pre-K, but they're in child care, those dollars under the proposal, the funding for the pre-K is going to come now through this formula for the 4-year-olds. And so for the dollars that they would have used from child care subsidy will be still available for before and after care, but it also should free up additional dollars to go towards child care subsidy.
Yes, Senator Conway.
In terms of the pre-K and not so much child care subsidy, and I understand the system that you have because you said the expansion grants are still in place. But did you finally find out from the last session exactly where, since we were not counting pre-K in any of our numbers or kindergarten, where they factor in to the poverty piece of it, the poverty grants? Because the last time we discussed, you said they weren't being counted. So in terms of the poverty index, where does these students come in? Are they still not counted?
Right. So in the data that is currently collected, 4-year-olds are not part of the free and reduced price meal count, to the best of my knowledge. So we don't have that data. It doesn't exist currently. It can be collected for the future, but
Let me just ask you this. I understand what you're saying, you don't have the data. But if these same students are part of subsidized child custody, couldn't you get some of the data from there to include them in the concentration of poverty?
we can certainly look at that. I mean, the data would have to be, so now that we're now proposing that forms be collected again in the districts that are currently not collecting forms because of the CEP program, those forms could be collected from 4-year-olds as well, and 3-year-olds for that matter. So I think in the future that is possible.
So when is the future?
Well, that's a good question. I think one decision that needs to be made is when the forms would begin to be collected again, and how long. Baltimore City being the largest jurisdiction that does not collect forms currently, how long they will need to
Process
that
and
back up
begin
again.
collecting the information.
They're doing a pilot program this year, but I think it's like 25 schools, maybe. It's not a very large number of schools.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Delegate McIntosh.
I have a waiver.
There it is. It's on.
Aren't we giving them a waiver until a certain year? Baltimore City.
I think what you're referring to under current law,
Right.
there is a hold harmless provision in the compensatory education
Right.
formula that is essentially guaranteeing the proportion of free and reduced price meal students the year prior to the entry into the community eligibility provision program is a guaranteed amount through fiscal 25 in current law. Yes.
Already.
Okay. The last item on this page, I think that I didn't cover, is career counseling. And so one of the other pieces that we talked about funding, the commission recommended, is funding for a career counselor in every middle school and high school. And I think we talked about at the last meeting that we've actually adjusted that number up a little bit to reflect the median size of schools. So if a larger high school would have more than one career counselor. And that would, the funding would be start in fiscal 24 for that. And that is the full state side of the funding for career counseling. So that would be in fiscal 24.
And that That was pushed out from the original blueprint?
A little bit, I
Okay.
think.
Just trying to get a sense of the smoothing. The smoothing that has been done to make it a more even requirement on the part of the state, is that mostly taken care of in the by 2024? You understand my question?
I think I do. So, I think if we go to the yellow page with the yellow on the top,
Right.
I think that might. So you can see the commission phase in would have funded, and this is just the state share.
Right.
In fiscal 21, 758 million, then the 1.4 billion, 1.6 billion, 1.7. So it was very, very front loaded.
Right.
So this is smoothing it much more, so more than just in the first couple of years.
Right.
And so proportionally, as each year as we get through each year,
Right.
we get closer and
Yeah. You can see by,
cumulatively closer.
right. You can see by your fiscal 25, the margin is less, and it keeps
Exactly.
getting less as you go along.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. Does
That's
that-
helpful. Yes.
okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So I think the next thing maybe to,
Could you tell us, you're following the overview of the work?
sort of.
Okay. So what bullet are we on now, would you say?
Well, I would say we're definitely through the first page, and I do want to just note the last bullet on the first page. I think it
yes.
still is the last bullet.
Yes, Superintendent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to follow up on the senator's question regarding pre-K being included in the concentration of poverty. So for schools that do have all-day pre-K,
Full day.
full-day pre-K, those parents and students do fill out forms in order to get their lunch.
They fill out the forms.
They do.
Excellent. Right.
So the concentration of poverty, is that completely just based on lunch forms?
Well, so not in Baltimore City because
Well,
they don't collect forms.
right.
Right.
Let's-
So that's
Outside of the districts that do not collect forms.
outside of the CEP districts. Yes, the count is based on forms for full day 4-year-olds, right?
Yes.
Obviously not the half day. Right.
Yes.
So
Once you start collecting.
So once you start collecting,
Okay.
right, so we're back, right, once the forms are collected.
For you.
And I mean, I think that it's possible that the forms could be collected sooner than fiscal 25. The hold harmless is in statute currently until fiscal 25, but there could be, I don't know, let's say they started collecting the forms in fall of 20, next fall or fall of 21. Let's say fall of 21 would be like the full, that would be fiscal 23 funding. And it could be sort of a, we like to do this, right? Greater of. So it could be the greater of the hold harmless or the count through the forms. Something like that. Okay, so thank you, that's really helpful, thank you. The last bullet on the first page, I just wanted to point this out. I know Dr. Thornton had asked this question at the last meeting of whether the progressivity of the proposal, and absolutely under this proposal, the progressivity of the finance system, both state and local funding, would be significantly improved to what it is currently. Page 2 then of the overview. I think what we will do is just walk through the county by county numbers for state and local funding. So the next sheet in your folder should be something called fiscal 2021 state funding. That is it, yes. So I talked about these components, but this shows you the components county by county. So for the college and career readiness, for the first column, these are dollars that are being provided for every student towards college and career readiness by 10th grade. And then for those who are not college and career ready by 10th grade, for the 11th and 12th grade, additional doing things differently, not just repeating the same class over again. And so that totals the $31.9 million. This is in fiscal 2021. The next two columns reflect the new funding formula that will be for the post-college and career readiness and CTE pathways. This is based on the number of 11th and 12th graders who are college and career ready, and it provides the additional $500 in each 11th and 12th grade for these pathways to be more rigorous for CTE and for early college credit, including potentially earning an AA degree while you're still in high school. And so you can see the state aid and the local aid are basically the same amount, $10.1 million. In fiscal 21, as a transition year, the state would provide both the state and the local share of that funding. And beginning in fiscal 22, the state would provide the state share and the locals would be expected to pick up the local share. And then in the far right two columns is the funding for teacher supplies and technology. As I said, it amounts to about $83 per teacher in the state. And it is split. There's a state and a local split. And the in the first year, 21, the state is going to pick up both pieces. And starting in fiscal 22, again, the counties would be expected to pick up their share. There aren't any questions on fiscal 21. We can move to the next page, which is, it says state aid and local funding at the top. And it has the increases for fiscal 22 and 23. And it's a long sheet. It's a single long sheet. Okay. So this reflects the dollars that I discussed on the fiscal 20 to 24 page by program. This shows those dollars distributed through the formulas beginning in fiscal 22. The foundation formula beginning in fiscal 22 will be funded based on the greater of the September 30th count or the rolling 3-year average. The declining enrollment grants actually are already gone in current law, so we no longer have those. The NTI grants that are provided to the counties that benefited from the November NTI, using November NTI wealth, are also rolled into the foundation. There are some dollars provided to the counties that benefit from the September NTI count as a transition. And over time that would phase out, but for 22 and 23, those dollars are still provided under the state funding in addition to the supplemental grants. Staff has recommended eliminating those, and they would be eliminated but it would be a phase out after fiscal 23 out to sometime before fiscal 30. And so in the fiscal 22 column, you can see overall state aid is growing 450 million above current law. And you can see the amount of increase for each jurisdiction. The average increase is 8.2%. There are some a little lower and some a little higher. And then depending on whether you're looking at the dollars or the percent increases. In 2023, again, this also reflects inflation through the foundation each year. And you can see it is a total increase of $648.9 million in fiscal 23 over current law, which is 11.5%. And so as I talked about programmatically, so the dollars for college and career readiness, for the teacher supplies and technology, for the additional teacher salary increases in 22 and 23, for the post-CCR pathways, for concentration of poverty, for English learners, for special education, for transitional supplemental instruction, for pre-K. All of those are built into the numbers that you're seeing here, and these are the total increases for each county school system.
Yes, Secretary Brinkley.
I just want to clarify so I understand the column. But I understand this local share now. I'm looking at 22
right.
or 23.
I hadn't. Yeah. Let me describe it. I hadn't gotten to those yet.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So that's the left side of the page is the state aid. The right side of the page is local funding. And what we've shown here, so the state aid is shown as increases over current law. The local share is shown as if the local share of all of the formulas was required to be funded by the counties in fiscal 22 compared to our projected local appropriation for each county, which is not a perfect match for MOE, but it is based on the trend line of what each county has been providing in the recent 5 to 7 years. And so then the difference.
Executive Glassman has a question.
Just on that point, do these pretty much, if we're taking out the escalator, are you just using MOE where the counties currently are, where they currently are funding?
So for fiscal 22, we don't have a current funding. So this is the projected local appropriation in fiscal 22 based on enrollment growth in each county and the trend of what that county has been doing in the recent few years.
So last week we had a chart that had with the escalator in there. Are we going to get a chart without the escalator?
Yes. You have one, I think.
We can get to that.
That'd be great.
Yeah, all right.
Okay.
But
the
we're going off of what, so counties aren't going to be able to go backwards.
No, counties are definitely not going to be able to go backwards.
Okay, because some of the charts kind of show savings, like they may have that option, but counties currently right now are going to go forward, not be able to go backwards on maintenance of effort.
No,
May not have an escalator, but that where we're at today is the floor of where we're going.
Absolutely. I think there's something not in the folders. I need a clean folder to look through. But maybe this is somewhat helpful. I know this is all confusing. There's another page called local contribution. This is not about fiscal 22 or 23. This is about fiscal 30 when everything is fully implemented, but in fiscal $20. So because, again, we don't have a projected MOE appropriation for each county for each year. We've never needed that, so we don't have it. It's possible, but at this time, we don't have it. So the way that we think about the comparison is to put it in $20 and then look at it against MOE under currently for this year, fiscal 20. And so the far left column is what the counties would be required to put in total if the local share of all of the formulas was required. So that is the $7.384 billion. The next column shows with this trigger that we've talked about for concentration of poverty, where only the counties that are benefiting from the compensatory education floor are actually paying the local share of concentration of poverty. So if we do that, then the next column shows the total local share with the dollars backed out for those counties that don't have to pay the local share of concentration of poverty. That's the $7.173 billion. Okay. So then we're going to compare that $7.12 billion to the next column, which is what each county is spending in what each county is required to spend in fiscal 20 under MOE. So that's the $6.459 billion. So then the next column is the higher of those two columns, because in the future you're going to have to either do MOE based on the prior year appropriation times your new enrollment, or the local share of the formulas, whichever is higher. So this column shows which one is higher, and it varies by county. So Allegheny County, under if just paying the local share of the formulas, they would actually be able to reduce their appropriation a little bit compared to MOE, except if we're going to use the higher of, then they would not be able to back off their effort. And you can sort of run down and do that comparison for each one. So for Anne Arundel County, the local share of the formulas is more than what their MOE requirement is. So their new MOE would be the local share of the formulas. However, if you go to the far right column and look at the fiscal 20 appropriations, you can see that Anne Arundel County is funding more than MOE already. They're not funding the full local share amount that they would have to fund, but they're already above MOE. So the delta for them is not the comparison to the MOE column, it's the comparison to the fiscal 20 appropriations column. And that varies for each county, which is why there's not a difference column there.
Yes, yes, Dr. Davis.
Yeah. Still staying with Anne Arundel County.
Yeah.
That you mentioned. In fiscal 22, their local share is 606, right? Is that what you're referencing?
Fiscal 22. I think you're on a different sheet.
I am. I thought you were going back and forth between the two. So I see. So you're just staying on this
Yeah, I was
sheet.
walking through all the
Understood.
columns on the local contribution
Okay.
sheet.
All right. I thought, yeah, I was going here too. Okay.